Way of the Night, Ailell. Written by Secret Agent Fan. Read by Rashi. Imperial Year 1185. The Valley of Torment. Half-molten rocks sizzled against regulation plate metal and leather. A smoke-veiled Lord Gwendol shouted inaudible orders while dividing the army into offensive positions the way a butcher carves a particularly prized slab of meat, piece by piece, meticulously. Ashe tested his bowstrings for perhaps the 17th time that afternoon. He was, like always, positioned near the rear of the army. It would be a while before Lord Gwendol would address him, if he would at all. Across the valley, the enemy's arm prepared. The Crest of Flames banner cut through the haze and heat, and no matter where Ashe looked, it always seemed to be in his line of sight.
"How long do you think this'll take?"
the banner for House Rowe asked. Ashe blinked, looked down. A brunette boy who couldn't have been much older than Lysithea was staring up at him. He held the banner, twice his size, in freckled hands, and when he shuffled, light from the fires around him caused the polished short sword at his hip to glint. "I'm not sure," Ashe replied honestly. "It depends whether the enemy decides to walk into the ambush or retreat."
"They can retreat?"
Ashe almost winced at the hope in his voice. This was a child looking for payment, not a soldier, not a knight.
"Then we can just go home?"
"Then we chase them." The boy did not reply. "Steel yourself," he found himself offering. The boy's body grew rigid. Bad tactic. Ashe put a hand on his shoulder and squeezed. He was careful not to jostle the banner, although the teen's shaking was doing that well enough. He whispered, "Once you place the banner, keep a tight grip on your sword, and focus on protecting yourself. You'll get through this." The boy's grip on the banner eased a little. Ashe smiled at him. After a moment, the boy nodded back. His shaking slowed. A wyvern was flying in the distance, and Ashe's hand went to his arrows. Firing from here would be easier. Ashe wouldn't have to see the face of who he was killing. He would only have to wonder if he knew them. A bead of sweat ran down the back of his neck as he wheeled his aim to steady. The wyvern disappeared behind a pillar of smoke, and he threw the arrow back into his quiver with a sigh. Not yet. The Crest of Flames banner continued to wave.
"You look sad."
Ashe winced. The boy placed the Rowe banner somewhere and was looking at him. "I'm all right. This part of battle is just stressful. The waiting, you know." He backpedaled, not wanting to dishearten the boy any more than he already had. "Of course, just the waiting is the stuff of poems. In this location, I mean. Flames lend themselves well to—"
"You're thinking about poetry? Now?"
Ashe frowned. Before he could relegate this child with the benefits of reading epic poetry, for morale, of course, he was interrupted.
"Please stop."
The voice sounded lost.
"I thought you were scared too. That's why I talked to you. You were making this scared face, but you're not scared at all. You're all comfortable now."
Ashe swallowed. "I wouldn't say comfortable."
"No, you are. It's in your eyes. You're like all the other soldiers here. How many battles have you been on?"
"A few," Ashe gently replied, trying to wave off 5 years of war.
"I don't understand at all. Why are you still doing this? Haven't you made enough by now?"
Ashe shook his head. It wasn't like that. It wasn't about the money. Well, it mostly wasn't about the money. I am a knight by choice.
"Why would you ever want to be a knight?"
Ashe's reply was drowned out by a fearsome shout and clopping hooves. "Look alive, boys." He was riding a white horse, his silver plate armor reflecting the shining pools of lava like it had been sculpted from liquid flame. Grey hair was glued to the back of his neck with sweat and soot, but he was smiling, a carefree, even youthful smile, as he held his lance aloft. Ashe felt himself exhale, exhilarated, before he could stop himself. No. Lord Gwendol! Look! Ashe wanted to shake his companion until his head bobbed up and down like a rag doll. "Look at that! Don't you see?" There was a pressure on Ashe's arm, and the boy had involuntarily grabbed his sleeve. He was staring at Lord Gwendol with a new light in his eyes. A victorious grin spread across Ashe's face. He gave the boy a little nudge. "Lift your sword."
"What?"
"It is time for the Grey Lion's infamous battle cry." As if to demonstrate, he lifted his bow in the air, matching Gwendol's lance as best he could. Tentatively, the young soldier beside him raised his sword with him. "Ready?" "All together now!" Gwendol bellowed. "For Rowe!" "For Rowe!" Ashe echoed, voice blending cacophonously with the rest of the scattered army. Their voices echoed through the valley, cutting through the volcanic noise as if it were a baby's rattle. The Crest of Flames banner still stood, but Ashe felt, for the moment, that he didn't have to look at it.
"Wow,"
the boy whispered after. I know, Ashe replied. His body felt awake and lighter than it had since he first saw the enemy. I know. They were losing. Claude's troops were organized and relentless. It took everything they had to hold the line and prevent them from advancing. At this point, breathing simply wasn't an option. Swords clashed, soot was on everyone's faces, blood and skin and fire saturated the air. It was like madness. Ashe's fingers were past trembling. They bled on his bowstrings. The valley itself wouldn't allow any humans, regardless of banners, to stay here much longer. Ashe struggled to see through the grime that had built up on his forehead. His boots, probably the most expensive thing he owned, were melting. Claude was a yellow terror, his massive wyvern plucking fully armed row soldiers from where they stood and dropping them into pits of lava like they were pebbles in a lake. They screamed as they fell. They needed something to turn this around, or none of them would be going home. Then came the wyvern above them, its bulky form covering Ashe, and the boy beside him in a shadow blanket. It wasn't Claude's. The color was different. The wings were tilted down. It was looking to land. It would land faster than Ashe could fire. If they were still, maybe they could catch it then. Don't move, Ashe whispered, but his companion was already running. We need to run! No, please listen to me! He reached for the team's arm. A glint of axe metal, and the team was swiftly decapitated. His body fell to the ground in two separate, awful thuds. Ashe wished he had a name to call out. His heart beat in his ears. Tears pricked at his eyes, but he didn't have time for them. The wyvern rider was exerting herself, pink hair frizzing in a way it never had in Ashe's memory. The sight was foreign, as she was familiar. Hilda. Ashe had trained with her, but they had never really had much of a conversation. A messed-up part of him was grateful for that, now that she had to die. He pulled his arrow back and prepared to fire as she moved to strike another soldier. Enemy. Not so fast, Ashe. Ally. Ashe's heart screamed, entirely incorrectly. He fumbled at the familiar voice, letting loose the arrow. Hilda squeaked as it flew past her ear, barely managing to dodge it. If Ashe hadn't been distracted. At the telltale crackle in the air that came with magic, Ashe leapt out of the way and felt something in his heart shatter and float around helplessly. Damn, I missed. The way Ashe was back at the monastery trying to read while Sylvain tried to convince him to flirt with one of the visiting priestesses. Only Sylvain wasn't in uniform, and Ashe wasn't holding a book. Ashe had a bow in his hand, and they were going to kill each other. Sylvain, Ashe said, and didn't miss the hurt that passed over his former classmate's eyes. His armor was crafted from black material Ashe knew cost more than he had ever stolen or owned. The shoulders pointed out at strange, jagged angles. His fingers were glowing. Ashe never had him pegged as a magic user. He was intelligent, sure, but never wanted to let anyone know. A lot could change in 5 years. I guess if I get to say your name to throw you off, you get to say mine too. Sorry about the low bro, Ashe. Let's do this fairly, yeah? Ashe was frozen. Sylvain's face was relaxed. He was smiling an empty smile that Ashe felt carve into his chest. Look, I don't want to do this either. It doesn't have to be like this, you know? Sylvain kept talking, but Ashe couldn't hear him over his own hands. His fingers were still glowing, steadily charging a spell. He'd seen him do this to bandits before, distract them with pretty words and then strike. It was one of his scariest qualities on the battlefield. And now, Ashe was going to be a victim to it. I am a knight in service to Lord Gwendol of House Rowe, Ashe announced over Sylvain's insincere speech, not once taking his eyes off the charging spell. He refused to let his voice waver. Who are you serving, Sylvain? Sylvain's fingers twitched, and that hesitation was enough to allow Ashe to draw his bow back and aim not for him, but Hilda. The arrow pierced the wyvern's throat, and Hilda cursed loudly. Soot and lava flew into the air, and Ashe toppled over with the force of the roaring wyvern's beating wings. Smoke filled his mouth, and he choked, landing on top of the corpse of the teen from earlier. Ashe only vaguely registered Hilda and Sylvain's frantic conversation. Hilda leaping off the rampaging wyvern, tossing Sylvain something long and thin, and running in the opposite direction, weaving through what remained of Gwendol's forces to... What? Sylvain's lance was at his throat before he could retrieve his bow, which had slipped out of his fingers. Ashe's hands twitched usefully against his dead friend's still warm body. Please, don't move, Sylvain said. He looked ridiculous, clearly exhausted, covered in soot and wielding the Lance of Ruin on foot when he was clearly meant to be on a horse. But Ashe was in no position to comment. You're unarmed, Ashe. Gwendol's not going to make it through this, so just give up. Surrender. Gwendol? Ashe thought. A chill spread in his chest. That was where Hilda was headed. The battle would end. Gwendol would die. House Rowe would lose one of its bravest knights. A knight Ashe had sworn an oath of loyalty to. A knight Ashe had dedicated his life to serving. No. No, this couldn't happen. Ashe wouldn't let it happen. Ashe wrenched the sword from where it was still clutched tight in his dead companion's hand, and with all the strength he could muster, knocked the Lance of Ruin into a nearby lava pit. Shit! Sylvain! Another voice. Ashe winced. Gwendol didn't have time for this. It was like stabbing anyone else. The foreign blade slid inside Sylvain easily enough that Ashe felt empty. Ashe didn't want to consider if the strike was lethal. He didn't want to consider anything at all. He had a goal. Sylvain sputtered something, but Ashe was already shoving him off, pulling the sword from his side in barely enough time to block the strike aimed straight for his throat. Felix's eyes were murderous, and not to be avoided. His strikes were fast and deadly. Ashe was far from a swordsman. Every bit of focus he still possessed was put towards holding on to his blade and not being cut to pieces. Blood fell from a newly blossoming wound in his chest, and Ashe stumbled backwards, refusing to fall. His grip on the stolen sword tightened. "Still standing?" Felix asked, but his voice was frigid. "We'll change that." "Felix, wait!" Ashe began. "You drew first blood. Deal with the consequences." First blood. Ashe's stomach churned. There was a flash of white magic behind Felix, and Ashe realized that someone was healing Sylvain. He was surprised by the contradictory relief that filled him. He tried to stamp it out. Silence it. He made an oath. He was a knight. "I can't turn back," Ashe announced, more to himself than anyone. "I'm sorry." "Enough words." Another strike, this one piercing Ashe's shoulder. Ashe only felt it after his left hand was hanging limp at his side. It burned. This was terrifying. Felix was terrifying. Ashe had never felt more like a child, frightened and yet awestruck. He knew he wasn't going to survive this. His vision was blurring. Taking a shallow breath, he spoke. "You know, you really are just like the knight in the story." And Ashe's sword met flesh. Ashe wasn't certain which one of them looked more surprised. Felix's eyes were wide, lost, and he looked at the sword piercing through his chest. Ashe felt sick. "Felix!" Sylvain. Ashe let go of the sword from where it was stuck inside Felix. Numbness spread through his hands all the way to his knees. They both stumbled backwards. Felix's legs gave out, but Sylvain was ready for him. Light from a psychic spell, and Sylvain's own basic healing magic surrounded them both. Ashe was not so lucky. He hit the scorched earth hard, immobile left arm screaming at the heat and impact. His arms clumsily caught on the hot coals in a sorry attempt to shield his face. But what was the point? His siblings would never see his body anyways. His vision clouded, and abruptly, he stopped feeling pain altogether. This was it. A night's end. Focus blurred. His mind drifted. He hoped Lenato would be proud of him, what he stood for, what he did. His mind emptied, until one crystal-clear thought remained. It was desperate. Secret. "I don't want to die," Ashe thought. "I don't want to." Voices. Hazy. Distant. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to ask him." "Ask him what?" "My friend, you can't ask an enemy soldier." "I can." "You can't, but—" "I'm wasting my breath. You're just going to do it anyways, aren't you?" White light. Ashe cried out at the abrupt return of sensation. He was bleeding. It hurt like hell. Someone was gripping his collar. "Ashe, look at me. Now." A woman's voice. Empty. Forceful. Ashe winced. He knew this voice. His mind sluggishly registered the feeling of something blunt at his throat. Ashe looked into a pair of eyes he had dreamed about more than he was proud to admit. "Professor?" She was supposed to be dead, but Ashe had heard rumors, had seen her crest somewhere. He was glad she was okay. She shook him. Hard. Ashe's eyes opened. Wide. "Why?" Something vague and regretful passed across her face. "I'm sorry, Ashe. Don't fall asleep. Listen to me. Tell me you're listening." Ashe tried to nod, but then found that he couldn't move his head. Whatever was pressed against his throat was large enough to lock him in place. His head felt hazy again, but he forced his eyes to stay open. For her. It was really hot. Why was it so hot? "I'm listening." "Gwendol is dead. Are you still going to attack us?" Gwendol? Dead? Who? Only one face came to mind. "Lenato?" He felt the professor's frustrated exhale, cool against his burning face. "This isn't working. I'm healing him more." "Hang on now." Another flash of white light. Ashe made a weak sound in the back of his throat as more wounds made themselves apparent. His chest hurt, but with the pain came clarity. Ashe remembered the battle, remembered his nameless friend, remembered the feeling of Sylvain and Felix's blood on his hands. And for what? He had failed. Again. Lord Gwendol. Tears came to Ashe's eyes. He refused to let them fall. He wasn't sure if he succeeded. My friend, I don't think anything he says like this is going to be reliable. A yellow blur, somewhere behind Violet's left shoulder. Claude, Ashe realized. He was holding a basic iron axe to Ashe's throat. The wood was under his chin, and the blade was pressed against his jugular. A spark of fear ran through Ashe's body at what that meant. This is a test, isn't it? Ashe asked. His voice felt raw. It is, the professor confirmed. We need to know you can be on our side again. You could die here, Ashe. You can join us, and live. Sylvain and Felix are healed now. They'll be fine. The professor's face was starting to blur at the edges. Ashe blinked a few times, trying to clarify. She was covered in sweat and soot, too. They all matched, which was kind of nice. That's good, Ashe mumbled. Claude huffed out a sigh, and Ashe bit his tongue to wake up further. He had to focus. Ashe, you still have to answer my question. Will you join us? There was a correct answer to this question. Ashe knew it. Yes. That's good enough for me, the professor said. Lower your axe, Claude. Ashe could hardly see now. He looked for the professor's eyes, but couldn't find them. His body felt heavy. Your axe, Claude. I asked you to lower it. You're really sure about this? Yes. And you are, of course, understanding that I completely disagree with you on this, my friend. Fundamentally. I thought you would, Claude. Give me time. The axe vanished from under Ashe's throat, and Ashe pitched forward in its absence. He fell straight into a yellow cape and waiting arms.